sport. He'd release them into the wilderness, give them a head start, and then hunted them down with a rifle and a knife. Once he had killed them, he'd keep pieces of their jewelry as souvenirs. His final victim managed to escape his clutches, and thankfully, Hanson was arrested for his heinous crimes. My aunt has no doubt in her mind that he planned on playing a sick little game with her as well. A little game of life and death. I heard somewhere that 5 out of every 1,000 people go missing in Alaska. I'm just glad my aunt wasn't one of them. My friend John recently convinced me to share this story that happened to us near McCall, Idaho. We'd like to hear what you all make of it, 'cause it sure beats the hell out of us. John's parents owned a lakeside cabin, and we had decided to spend the weekend there with our other friend Tom. We just planned on kicking back with a few beers, going out and enjoying nature. This place was quite a ways out of town, pretty much in the middle of nowhere. Not another living person around for miles in any direction. We shared some laughs on our journey there, talking about all the things we were going to get up to. The place was a small but stunning log cabin, overlooking this picturesque little lake. We spent what was left of the daylight unpacking, cracking open cold ones, and swimming in that lake. We dived off the wooden dock into the water, cannonballing each other and just generally having a fun time. Nighttime rolled around, and the three of us were playing cards inside the living room area of the cabin. It was a nice, peaceful evening, and we were starting to wind down after the long day. Now, it was a relatively quiet night, but at around 11 p.m, things became real silent. Any rustling outside had stopped, along with the sound of the breeze and the hooting of birds. Out of nowhere, this eerie silence just filled the air. There was nothing suggesting danger, but we all looked at each other, like we all felt something strange in the atmosphere. It's hard to explain, but for a few seconds, the nothingness felt like something horrible. That's when this loud splash broke the silence. It sounded like something huge had just fallen from a great height into the lake. We rushed outside to see what it was. That's the curious part. The water was completely still, no ripples whatsoever. But there was something there, something large floating in the lake. We got nearer to the water's edge to take a closer look. We could make it out now. It wasn't a thing. It was a person. A body floating face down in the water, arms outstretched. It looked like a man, and it seemed as if we were too late to help. The body was bloated, like a waterlogged corpse. Where the hell had he come from? Nobody else was meant to be around anywhere nearby. We all started freaking out, and John ran down to the wooden dock's walkway to try and pull the guy out. I fumbled for my phone to call for an ambulance. Tom looked on in horror as John got to the end of the walkway and kneeled down to grab the body as it floated by the dock. As I was on the phone, I heard John shriek. Something had spooked him real bad. Tom ran to his aid, but John came rushing back to intercept him, pale as a ghost. Guys, there's nothing we can do for him. He's gone. Come on, let's get back inside. Upon hearing this, Tom looked concerned. Dude, he said, we can't just leave him there. We have to get him out. Tom started moving towards the body. No, Tom, said John. Not you. Come on, back inside, now. John's tone was so serious. I hadn't heard him speak like that in the longest time. It kind of frightened me, to be honest, and it definitely convinced Tom, who turned back and hurried inside the cabin. We all waited in the living area for the ambulance to arrive, looking outside every now and then to see the body still floating face down in the water. The old red and blue lights took a long time to get to us, but as soon as they pulled up, we rushed out to greet them. We told them about the body in the lake and went to point it out to them. But that's the thing. It wasn't there. The corpse was nowhere to be seen. Where the hell had it gone? Had it sunk? Divers searched the small lake and found no trace of a body whatsoever. The water was empty. There were absolutely no tire tracks near the cabin. Nothing unusual or out of place. Nowhere for anyone to go. Where the hell had the corpse gone? The man had been face down in the water for ages. He wasn't exactly in any condition to just stand up and walk away. If this was some guy just messing with us, we had no idea how or why. This whole experience shook me up pretty bad, but I honestly wouldn't be sharing this story if it wasn't for what John told me. Remember that John shrieked? Well, he hadn't told us what scared him so much that night because he didn't want to freak Tom out. But, in private, John confessed to me what had happened. He said that as he leant down to examine the body, the corpse's head turned up to look at him. Its hand grabbed his arm. Its face was charred, its eyes milky white. "It looked at me, bro," said John. "It looked at me and it said, 'Why you, not Tom?'" John told me this with complete sincerity, and I, for one, believe him. We've never been back to that cabin since, and I think we'll keep it that way. My boyfriend and I were driving through Northern California. This was some time ago now, so I forget which city we were heading to. We were only going to take some pictures. My boyfriend was a photographer, and he needed to snap something specific for work. We didn't know where we were going, and we took a wrong turn somewhere. We ended up in the middle of Nowheresville, so we pulled on over to the side of the road to work out where the hell we had gone wrong. As we were discussing directions, this rusty old pickup truck comes moseying on down the road behind us. It pulls up just behind our car, and this tall, beardy, cowboy-looking fella steps out. He approaches the driver's side window of our car. My boyfriend winds it down. Instantly, the smell of booze hits us. This guy reeked of it. The man asked where we were headed. We told him. "Oh yeah, that's just up yonder in these hills. No more than a couple of miles," he said in a deep, gravelly voice. His throat had obviously been punished by years of alcohol abuse. "You just need to take a quick picture, right? It's easier if you just get in with me. I'll drive you back here afterwards." He kept on aggressively insisting that we get in his truck with him, that he'd drive us up into the hills to our destination. "Get in. Come on, I'll take you. Get in." I knew this guy wasn't to be trusted. So many bad vibes. My boyfriend, on the other hand, was on the verge of getting out of our car and joining him. Had I not been there, I'm sure he would have. I hit the lock all doors button and told my boyfriend to floor it. He looked confused, but obliged. As we sped away, we heard the guy shout something. Since my boyfriend's window was still open, we heard him clear as day. "Oh, you made the right choice." He cackled as he turned away. We soon learned that our destination was 20 or so miles in the opposite direction, not up the hill like this man had said. What did he have planned for us up there? I don't like to think about that too much. Where I live, semi-rural East Tennessee, we have our very own version of Freddy Krueger. If you're from my neck of the woods, you may have heard of him. He's known as Skinned Tom. In life, Tom was a good-looking guy who liked the ladies. Once he had dated all of the available girls in his area, he started seeing a girl in the next town over, not knowing that she was married. Eventually, her husband got wind of what was going on and vowed revenge on the two of them. He told his wife that he was going out of town for the weekend. Then he hid in the woods behind their house. As he had guessed, that evening, Tom showed up to take the lady out. The husband followed them to a nearby lover's lane. Things were getting pretty hot and heavy when all of a sudden the car door was jerked open and Tom came face to face with one very huge, very angry looking man wielding a hunting knife. "Oh God," screamed the girl. "It's my husband." "That's right, you dirty tramp," yelled her husband. "And I'm about to teach you a lesson you'll never forget." He pulled her off Tom, rammed the knife into her stomach once, and then tossed her aside. Then he turned back to Tom, grinning maniacally. "Don't hurt me," begged Tom. "I swear to God, I didn't know she was married." But the wronged husband didn't listen. There, deep in the forest, he pulled Tom out of the car, dragged him deep into the woods, and skinned him alive with the hunting knife. The husband then handed himself into the police. When the cops went to investigate the crime scene, they found a whole body's worth of human skin hanging from a tree branch. What they never found, however, was Tom's body. It had disappeared, along with the hunting knife. It's easy to see how an urban legend was born out of this killing. To this day, many people still say that they've seen the spectre of Tom walking in those woods. Stories of alleged sightings have circled around East Tennessee for years. He's described as a bloody skeleton in 1920s clothing, carrying the knife he himself was skinned with. All the teenagers around here grow up hearing, "Don't go to Lover's Lane if you don't want to be Skin Tom's next victim." That image of a bloody red man with a knife has always creeped me out. You won't catch me around Lover's Lane, I can assure you of that. A big thank you to Anthony Salinas for making the thumbnail for this video. You can check out more of his artwork by following the link in the description below. I'd also like to thank my biggest supporters on Patreon: John Crouch, Ray Price Burton, Marley Wright, Number 1. This is only a short story, but one I really want to share. There was this girl who I'd been seeing for a few months. I was 21 and she was 24 and had a boy about 2 years old. She was basically normal, had a good job, took care of her kid okay. She was kind of a dim bulb though, not very bright. I was bored in the relationship and really didn't want to become a stepdad to the kid, so I ended it. No problem, right? I run into her about a month or so later at a bar, and we end up going back to her place for a night of sex. Next morning, she makes coffee and breakfast. I go to school and she goes to work. I get incredibly sick on my way to school, and I vomit multiple times. I make it to school, and I'm still puking, so I find the nurse or medical office, and vaguely recall being loaded into an ambulance. It's all blank after that. I come to in the hospital. A doctor tells me that I OD'd on a huge amount of meth and had about 5 minutes left to live before they figured it out. Oh, and by the way, he tells me, there are some federal agents here to talk to you. Turns out, she planned this whole thing and decided that if she couldn't have me, then no one could. She went to jail, but got a reduced sentence for turning on the family member who was making and distributing the meth. Number 2.
In my late teens, I began a serious relationship with my first ever boyfriend. When I was young, I had zero confidence and no self-esteem, and a warped idea of what a relationship should be due to witnessing those of adults around me. Being so shy and innocent, I fell madly in love. I'm still not sure how. From the beginning, the relationship was controlling and abusive on his part, and it still makes me angry now, more so that I put up with it for 5 years. He hated my friends and family for no apparent reason, and I had to really fight to keep other relationships going. But as I got older, I got sick of his shit, and when my family was away for the weekend, I found the perfect opportunity to invite all my friends around for the evening. He tried to put a stop to it with threats and abuse, but I didn't let up, and my friends arrived around 7 p.m. We were sitting in the living room, drinking and chatting with nibbles and music. But all night, my boyfriend was calling my phone, demanding that I make my friends leave and walk to his house to bring him alcohol. My friends soon caught wind of it, and they were already unhappy about me being with him. After a few drinks, I started to ignore the calls, and the conversation turned to my boyfriend. My friends expressed their anger and dislike to him with the usual, "You can do better," "You need to get rid of him," and "He doesn't deserve you." Generally, we enjoyed the evening, and my friends began to leave around 1 a.m. I wasn't afraid to be alone in the house, as I have a Rottweiler. She's friendly as hell, but I was sure she'd protect me. As one of my male friends was about to leave, he stayed behind and gave me a real deep talk about how he felt about my boyfriend, and I agreed with him. I said goodbye and watched at the front door as my friends hurried into the dark and pouring rain to their cars before I went to the kitchen where I had left my phone to charge a little while earlier. As I picked up my phone, something in the kitchen window caught my eye. Standing directly outside my kitchen window in the dark and pouring rain, hooded and angry, was my boyfriend. He was scowling in at me from the darkness. He looked ready to kill. I screamed and we stared at each other for a while. I could see he was mortal drunk, as the whites of his eyes had gone pink, which made him look incredibly freaky as his eyes were blue. He turned away and disappeared. I knew I had to face him. I went out the back door onto the patio into the rain. He was standing a few feet away from me. He was breathing really loud and crying as he was so angry. He bent down and picked up a broken wooden broom handle. I asked him, "Are you going to use that on me?" And he said, "I'm going to hurt you so badly." I didn't know what to do. My heart was racing, but I was stuck in position and quite drunk. He growled and swung the handle into a flower basket above my head, which tipped sideways and spilled soil and flowers down my right shoulder. Then he slammed it on the floor and ran at me, grabbing me around the throat. My dog must have heard him throw the handle as she came bounding out the back door, making an angry snorting sound. She's always friendly and was familiar with him, so I didn't think she'd do anything as he started to strangle me. But she leapt up and took his arm by the sleeve and started to shake him by the arm. Seeing the fear in his face was priceless. He backed off and she calmed down. My boyfriend started to cry and told me that he had walked to my house a few hours ago, sneaking into the house through the back door and hiding in the cupboard under the stairs, where he had listened to every word me and my friends had said about him. I took my dog back inside and I locked the door. When I looked out the window, he was laying on the sun lounger in the rain crying. When he realized I wasn't going back out, he left. The thought of him makes my stomach turn.
Number 3. My mum dated this guy called Jim between the years of 2001 and 2003. He was a seemingly nice guy. Clean cut, had a gut but was easily over 6 foot and fairly built. No children and owned a property in a city in the Midwest. I remember being disappointed when she broke up with him, as he was lots of fun to be around, though she claimed that she didn't want to be with him anymore because he was a smoker. Fast forward about a year later. It was about 1 in the afternoon. My 13-year-old self is playing video games in my room while my mum is at work. I hear our garage door open, and given that we lived in a cozy townhouse, the sound of the door opening was relatively pronounced. I thought it was weird though, as my mum never came off work until about 4 or 5, and she would have called if she was getting off work early. So, I peer out of my window, which directly overlooks the driveway, only to see a silver Audi parked outside. Jim's car. After a few minutes, I'm thinking, shit, why's he at our house? She hadn't been communicating with him at all since they broke up. I don't think he got out of his car, because he eventually closed the door and pulled out of the driveway after a few minutes. This led me to believe that he still had our door code programmed into his car. In the past, he would stay over a lot, so the fact that he had our code wasn't as alarming as the fact that he still had it in his car. Had he come in, it would have been easy for him to hear me upstairs, given the size of our house. I ended up calling my mum and telling her that he had come by and opened the garage, presumably to see if my mum was home. She mentioned that he had recently been bugging her about some bottles of wine that he owned and wanted back from our house. Anyway, she said that she would change the garage code when she got home. But that never actually happened. Fast forward about 5 or 6 years during the summer. At the time, I was staying with my dad. One day, I received a call from my mum, asking if I had been to the house at some point during the day. She was somewhat grilling me because some obvious things like chairs in the kitchen had been moved out of place. My mum is a very particular person and likes to keep everything neat and organised. I kind of laughed and said no because I hadn't been to the house in a few days. I wasn't expecting her follow-up question. She asked me, "Did you put the dog in the bathroom and then pull the chair in front of the door?" This was incredibly odd, and she started to freak out after I still said no. I later found out that her ex never stopped emailing, texting, or calling her since they broke up. There were never actually any wine bottles either. He just kept badgering and harassing her for money. Given that nobody else had our garage code except for my dad, who was out of town at the time, all signs point towards the ex-boyfriend, Jim. It's creepy to think that he still had our garage code after so many years of being broken up and not communicating. It makes me wonder how many other times he might have come by, besides these 2 notable occurrences. Change your garage code after you get out of a relationship. You never know who may come by. Number 4.
First, the backstory. Growing up, my parents were incredibly strict and overprotective. No sleepovers, no boys, no going anywhere without their explicit approval after taking down who I was with, their phone numbers, their parents' phone numbers, and exactly what time I was expected back. And definitely no dates. I rarely even went out with friends. Going to see a movie on a Saturday was a special occasion. The only place I could get around my parents' rigid rules was online, where, because they didn't know how to use the computer, they never monitored me. That's why, in high school, I rebelled the only way I knew how. I started a blog. Yep, I was 17, and I ran an erotic blog. No, not porn, more like photos of myself wearing very low clothing, in bed, everything just so covered. For the purpose of anonymity, because as incredibly dumb and naive as I was back then, I had at least an iota of common sense. None of the photos showed my entire face, just my mouth or my jawline, the arch of my neck, never my eyes. Interspersed with the photos were the blog entries, the life of my amorously blessed alter ego, Claire. Claire was completely fictional, and therefore she was a lot of things I wasn't, primarily social and sexually active. I would fabricate stories of dates, affairs, sexual experimentation, just dumb romance novel type stuff, living vicariously through this confident, beautiful, made-up girl. I fancied myself an alright writer back then, but looking back, it's pretty funny now, because it was probably mostly just drivel. But I enjoyed running it, and my readers seemed to like it. You'd think it would have just been dirty old men, but I had quite a few women readers too, who told me how I was helping them become more confident as well. There was something just so exhilarating about having people be drawn to you online when you're so lonely and cloistered in real life. Anyway, fast forward 3 years. By now I was halfway across the country in college, out from under my parents' rule. I had a few good friends and I was doing pretty well. I still had trouble being very social because I was so unused to it, but at least I wasn't so lonely anymore. I hadn't updated the blog in over 2 years, and honestly, I had mostly forgotten all about it. I also had a boyfriend. His name was David, and we met in a history seminar fall my sophomore year. He was tall, lovely, and kind, and had quite improbably stuck past our awkward first date when I, shy and still mostly petrified of social interaction, could barely string together 10 complete sentences. But he seemed to like that I was so shy. He was, in contrast, outgoing and forward, making friends wherever we went. He would constantly tell me it was cute that I blushed when people talked to me, or say how I should be glad that he was with me to facilitate conversation with other people. One time, he told me I was lucky that he had stuck around because no other guy would have bothered. I was so affection-starved that I was convinced he was right. One day, about 3 months into the relationship, over Christmas break, I got a call from him at home. When I picked up, the first thing he said was, "Who's Claire?" It took a second, but when I realized what he must have been referring to, my entire body went cold. How was this possible? How could he have found out? What? I said. Claire. www.claireblog.com. Is this you? My heart pounded. My mind raced. I had no idea how he had found the blog. Could I possibly deny it? There was nothing on that entire website that linked back to my real name or my real email address. I had made sure of that. None of the photos showed my face, but they showed enough that if you knew me in real life, you could probably be able to tell it was me. Feeling cornered, I told him I would talk to him later and hung up. I spent that whole day on the verge of a panic attack. Finally, I realized I had to just admit it. For some reason, at the time, it seemed like the end of the world that my boyfriend had found my stupid blog from high school. I mean, nowadays I would be like, yeah, I ran a blog and posted hot pics of myself, so the fuck what? It was all just fiction anyway. But of course, I'm older and wiser now, and I was a fucking naive idiot back then. So I called him back, told him while crying all over the place about all the reasons I had written and maintained this blog, and eventually he said, "It's okay, I think I understand." At some point, I had asked him how he had found it, and he told me that an ex-girlfriend of his had seen posts on Facebook of us together, went on Google to search for me, and somehow turned up this blog, the link to which she then sent to David. "Sorry," he told me. "I don't talk to her anymore. She just so bothers me all the time. She's kind of a psycho." I was a little upset at that, but I didn't want to annoy him any further, so I didn't press the issue. Things went mostly back to normal. Then the email started. I woke up to the first one about a week later. It had been sent at 3 a.m. and was from some blatantly fake address. Claire_the_whore_6969 @ hotmail.com, or something like that. All it said was, "You're disgusting." I realized it must have been from David's psycho ex. I was a little unnerved, but I just deleted and ignored it. But the emails didn't stop. They kept coming, at least one, sometimes two a night. always from a new fake email, Claire the Slut 72993, Claire _ cocksucker, etc., etc. Always time-stamped exactly 3 or 4 a.m. The contents of the emails began to increase in the level of vitriol. First, it was more of the same variations of "you are so gross" or "you're fucked up." Then she would send me copies of the photos from my blog, which I had deleted right after David had confronted me about it, so she must have saved the entry somewhere, with horrible things written across them like "fat slut" or "die whore, kill yourself," etc. I showed David the emails and asked if he could make her stop, but he just shrugged and said it was out of his control. It kept escalating. She started mentioning my friends' names in the emails. Things like, "I showed Rachel and Alex your sick website, they're disgusted by you." Or, "I told Evan and James, they act like they're your friends, but behind your back they all think you're disgusting." Sometimes she would pretend to be one of my friends and write things like, "I said hi to you on campus yesterday and you think I like hanging out, but I know what you really are. You're just a whore." Once, she copied and pasted an entire blog entry into the body of an email. It was non-stop, night after night. I would wake up in the morning terrified of seeing another email from her in my inbox. I stopped opening them. I was constantly stressed. I never knew for sure if she had actually sent my photos around to everyone I knew. I lost sleep. I lost weight. I begged David to make her stop, but he kept saying there was nothing he could do. Things with David were deteriorating as well. He was annoyed that I kept bringing up the emails. He began to make it sound as though it were all my fault. He said it was hard to believe that I hadn't actually done all those sexual things I had written about. This was the kicker. His ex was from my hometown, he said, and she had told him stories that she'd heard from people I went to high school with about all the dirty things I used to do. Orgies, bondage, hard drugs. How could I lie to him and trick him into believing I was a shy virgin? He wanted to know. I told him none of those things were true. "She's obviously making it up. Do you really believe her over me?" I asked. "I don't know what to believe," he said. He told me I had become untrustworthy. As twisted as it was, I started to believe that too. I apologized to him over and over, until finally he forgave me and told me it was all right, that he believed me, that I was lucky he understood and would stay with me because who else would? I had never been so relieved. I was lucky. I was so lucky. Wasn't I? We had been taking things really slow physically because I actually was a virgin. And regardless of make-believe Claire's make-believe sexcapades, anything sex-related still made me incredibly nervous. But after that, I had sex with David for the first time because I felt like I owed him. He had stayed with me. I was so lucky. I didn't enjoy it. Afterwards, he whispered, "I believe you. You really have never had sex before." It felt sickly, like winning. Eventually, after about 2 months, the ex must have gotten bored because the emails slowed, and then they stopped. David broke up with me shortly after, cruelly and unkindly, the day after my 21st birthday. I was a complete wreck for a while, but hey, life goes on. 3 months or so after that, I got another email from clairebear69@hotmail.com at 3 a.m. "I can't believe you haven't killed yourself. You should." For the first time, I responded. "We're not even dating anymore. You're pathetic. Get a fucking life." That was the last I ever heard from her. To this day, I don't know her name. I don't know how she found my blog or how she knew the names of my friends or why she was so hell-bent on making me miserable for so long. Even now, when I get Facebook messages or emails from people I don't know, my first reaction is to panic. Of course, I've since realized that I was not at all lucky in my relationship, nor was David the sweet guy that I thought he was at the time. I understand now that it hadn't been my fault. I owed him nothing. It's been 5 years, but I haven't been in a relationship since. I don't know if I could. I think the worst is this. I used to enjoy writing. At one time, I was proud of my blog because, as small and insignificant as it was something I created. Even though it was make-believe, it was still mine. They had taken something I had been proud of and turned it into a source of shame. I don't like to write anymore. Even now I get angry at how they've taken that from me, and how easily I was fooled. How stupid. How naive. Eventually I got the story of their relationship and how they broke up, and why she was so psycho. The details are irrelevant, but suffice it to say, it turns out he had been even more awful to her than he had been to me. But instead of staying far, far away like I have done, all she wanted was for him to take her back. To clarify, none of the email addresses or web address used are real. It was just always something blatantly fake and throwaway like that.
Number 5. A few years ago, I was on the outs with a very dependent girlfriend. What started out as just casual dating turned into her practically living at my house, needing to constantly be in contact with me, and always trying to spy on my social media accounts. She was extremely depressed, and used my sympathy as a weapon to keep pulling me back whenever one of her crazy actions would push me away. It took my stupid younger self a long time to see the pattern. When I finally did, and she realized that she was losing me, she ran over my dog, thinking that the grieving process would bring us back together. The worst part is, it kind of did. The pain of having to drive my dog to the vet and put him down was too much for me to handle on my own, and for once, she was there for me instead of the other way around. Until a few weeks later, when she drunkenly admitted what she had done. I have never been so mad about anything. I was brought up to never raise my hand to a woman, but my morals were seriously tested at that point. I couldn't get the trip to the vet to put the little guy down out of my head. How could this person that I loved have done something so psychopathic? I threw all of her shit out and had to physically remove her from my house. I filed a restraining order, but before it went through, I had to threaten to press charges to keep her away. I haven't talked to her since. I feel bad for anyone that gets caught up in her psycho shit. I thought she loved me, but that really led me to wonder if she was some kind of psycho or sociopath who had been playing me for a fool the whole time. Hi guys, Lazy here, and thank you very much for listening. Special thanks to Eden and Lady White Rabbit for narrating the female perspective stories in this video. I thought that would make things, a bit more engrossing, and given the subject matter, I thought it worked really well. So make sure to check out both of their channels by following the links down below or by clicking on their icons on the screen right now. Stay spooky. So this took place way back in the 80s. I was living in Holland at the time, and one of my best friends over there was finally getting hitched. Needless to say, a crazy bachelor party had been planned. The husband-to-be was Ronnie, a real wild child. Now, Ronnie was the kind of guy who wasn't afraid to take on the world. He spoke his mind at all times, and unfortunately for the rest of us, his big mouth got us in trouble on more than one occasion. Regardless, he was a hilarious dude, a real character who was just so much fun to hang around with. Now, for the most part, the night went as planned. We must have consumed every type of alcohol in almost every bar in town. We'd been partying since 2 p.m, so by the time midnight rolled around, well, we were drunk as skunks. That's when Ronnie's big mouth got us into a whole bunch of trouble. We were all being loud and obnoxious people, like people on bachelor parties are. There was some guy standing by the bar. Now, we weren't in the nicest part of town, and this dude looked like the kind of guy you don't mess with. You could tell from the way he was dressed, from the tattoo on his neck, and the hard expression on his face. Speaking of face, this guy looked young. Younger than he actually was, that's for sure. I mean, he had a real mean case of the baby face, put it like that. Ronnie sees this guy, and he just can't help himself. He approaches him and says something stupid like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, what are this kid's parents thinking, letting him have a beer? Come on, buddy, time for bed." Then he pinched the guy's cheek. "You okay, little man?" He said a few other stupid things as well, but they escaped my mind. Not cool, I admit, but he was drunk and just playing around. Babyface turns to Ronnie, gives him this big, toothy smile, and laughs at him in an obviously sarcastic way. He then finishes his beer in a couple of big gulps, throws on his coat, and walks out of the bar. Doesn't say a word. Well, that was something, we all think. Anyway, the night goes on. Things start to wind down at around 3 p.m. We all stumble out of the bar and decide to head home. As we make our way down the streets, our numbers start to dwindle. People are branching off and heading their separate ways. After a while, the only people left are myself, Ronnie, and our good pal, Eric, a scrawny but happy chap. We were getting to the end of the street we were on, when a van suddenly pulls up ahead of us. The side door slides open, and guess who jumps out? Yeah, the young-looking thug from the bar. And he's not alone. He's brought 4 of his friends with him, and they're all built like tanks. They were holding baseball bats and metal poles, and they had clearly planned to ambush us. "That's them," says the young thug in Dutch. When you're staring at 5 gangster-looking, weapon-wielding men with bloodlust in their eyes, you sober up real quick. Ronnie, Eric and I turn and bolt. We could hear the footsteps and shouting of the thugs behind us, getting louder and louder as they gained on us. I was certain that if they got their hands on us, we were dead men. We got to a fork at the end of the street. We were just running on instinct at this point, and Derek and I turned left, while Ronnie turned right. I looked back to call for Ronnie, only to see 3 of the men still chasing behind me and Eric. They were like rabid dogs. There was no way the 2 of us could handle them. They were laughing as they chased us, yelling about how we were already dead, and how we'd messed with the wrong guy. We made it to a turn that led onto a residential street. I leap over the first fence I see and land in somebody's backyard. Eric quickly follows. I grabbed a shovel that was lying on the grass, and the 2 of us crouched up close against the fence, trying our best to stay hidden. I held the shovel tight and whispered to Eric, "The first one that comes over, I'm gonna hit him." I really meant it. I was gonna hit him on the head and probably kill the guy, but I meant what I said. I knew they'd probably kill us otherwise. Eric and I looked up at the house of the garden we were hiding in. the light in the bedroom window switched on. A middle-aged woman poked her head out. We must have woken her up. She looked down at the two of us, crouching in her yard, holding her shovel. Then she looked to the men chasing us. They had just turned the corner and were standing on the other side of the fence we were hiding behind. "Where the hell did they go?" we heard one say. We were terrified that they'd hear our heavy breaths. All I could do was grip the shovel tightly and prepare to strike. I prayed that I wouldn't miss. I prayed that I could fight the two that were left standing. The lady in the window called out to them. "Hey!" My heart sank. She was about to throw us to the dogs. Beads of sweat formed on my forehead. I closed my eyes. "I saw 'em. They went that way," said the lady, and pointed down one of the side roads. The thugs bought it and ran off into the night. This angel realized what was going on, and she had just saved our skin. She watched as we hopped over the fence and made a break for it in the opposite direction. We both gave her a nod before we sprinted off. I'd never been so grateful. This was before the days of cell phones, and we had no idea where Ronnie was. We went around to his house, but he wasn't there. We, of course, feared the worst. Thankfully, by the time the morning rolled around, he had re-emerged. He'd managed to slip away from the thugs, laid low for a while, and made it home without them following him. To this day, I'd say that's the closest I've come to dying. In hindsight, those guys must have been watching us from afar for a few hours, waiting for most of our group to leave so they could strike. They wanted Ronnie, but were more than happy to attack Eric and I, just for being friends with him. Luckily, we all escaped, and Ronnie got to marry his blushing bride and have a few kids. Never did learn to keep his mouth shut, though. Crazy Dutch bugger. You might think I'm crazy for sharing this story. Hell, I felt like I was crazy when it happened to me. But I swear, this is true, and I still don't have an explanation for it. Last year, a buddy of mine was getting married. When the night of his bachelor party rolled around, I was super stoked. Only problem was, I had a shift at work that night. I told the others that I'd join them at the bar as soon as I could. It was 8 PM when I finally got off work. I sent a text to my pal telling him I'd be there in 20 minutes. Then I grabbed my jacket and began my walk to the drinking hall. The road between my workplace and the bar was always empty and desolate, with a forest on one side and barren fields on the other. I hated working late, since walking this lonely road always gave me the creeps. On the rare occasions a car drove past and lit up the road ahead with its headlights, I felt more comfortable, even if just for a brief moment. Now, this night was particularly dark. I was using the flashlight on my phone to light the way. The phone rumbled in my hand. It was a message from my buddy. "Okay, see you soon." I was about 5 minutes into my journey when something caught my attention on the left. Far in the distance, in the open field, was a moving shape. A human shape, about 200 meters away. Whoever it was, they were alone, and they were slowly moving towards the road I was on. It seemed odd to me that someone was out there, walking through these empty fields in the dark, all by themselves. Still, I didn't pay it much mind. I continued on, keeping my eyes on the road for a few more steps. When I turned back to look at the distant figure, I was startled by how much closer they were to me now. Maybe only 100 meters away. They were still walking at the same pace a normal person would, but had gained an unnatural amount of ground in the few seconds I wasn't looking at them. It looked to be a tall, thin woman. I was more weirded out now, especially since she seemed to be walking directly at me. I walked a little bit faster, turning my gaze back towards the road. Then, After a few more seconds, I turned back to look at her again. Jesus, she was just 50 meters away now, moving like a moth attracted to the light of my phone. It didn't make sense. How was she getting so much closer every time I looked away? If she was sprinting, it still would have been inhuman, but she was just walking. "Hey," I called out. "Are you okay?" Her only reply was this strange hum. At no point did she stop walking, heading towards me like some kind of demented zombie. I briefly turned my eyes back to the road ahead, then back to her again. She was almost at the road's edge now, in the blink of an eye, and I could hear her footsteps squelching in the wet grass, slow and consistent. I picked up my pace. Don't look at her, I thought to myself. Don't look. The sound of her footsteps had changed. She was walking on tarmac now. I turned to look again. There, just behind me now, was this woman. Her eyes were hollow and pale, her face emaciated. She was just skin and bones, her hair scraggly and light. But the worst part was her mouth. It looked like it had been sewn shut, like with a needle and thread. I wanted to ask her if I could help her with anything, but the words wouldn't come out of my mouth. She looked at me for a few moments, before walking across the road and towards the woods on the other side. I sprinted off down the road, scared out of my mind. I looked behind me to see if she was following. All I could make out was her figure disappearing into the trees. I made it to the bar and rushed inside, desperate to tell my friends what I'd just seen. "Dude, good to see ya. What took you so long?" they asked me. "We were all getting worried about you." Work, like I told you," I replied, obviously distressed. "Whoa, are you okay, bud? We've been waiting for you for like 3 hours. Huh? What were they talking about? I'd sprinted half of my journey. That must have only been 10 minutes max. Confused, I checked my phone. As I did, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was 11:15 p.m. I'd left work at 8. I knew I had. The timestamp on the text message I sent my friend confirmed it. Somehow, on the short run from that girl to the bar, I'd lost 3 hours. There's no rational explanation I can come up with. Before this incident, I didn't believe in the paranormal, but I'm certain that the missing time and the girl were in some way connected. That was easily the creepiest experience of my life. It shook me to the bone, and even now, when it's dark, I still take the long way home from work, rather than walk down that lonely road by myself. This all happened in the summer of 2010. An old friend from school was getting married, and a group of 7 of us were going to his bachelor party. There was me, Killian, Sammy the Dude, Spanish Miguel, Aiden, and of course the guest of honor, Big Drew, the first of us to get hitched. Our friend Frank was also there, a nice guy who never did as much as hurt a fly in his whole life. It was my first bachelor party, and to tell you the truth, I was pretty excited. I'd seen how they were always portrayed in TV and movies. The debauchery, the wild dares, the whole boys being boys thing. I figured it was going to be the best night I'd never remember. Well, we started drinking pretty early in the afternoon, chugging beers, reminiscing about the good old days, and laughing about what married life would have in store for old Drew, like how he was going to have a dad bod, and how his wife was only going to let him out once a year for a beer with the guys. At some point, Somebody brought over a platter of shots. I've never held my liquor very well, but hey, it was my good pal's party, so it would have been rude to refuse. After that platter, somebody bought another one, and then another one. It all starts to get a little fuzzy after that. The next morning, I woke up fully dressed with the world's worst hangover. I checked the clock. 11 a.m. We were all staying at the same hotel, so I stumbled down to the breakfast area and found all my friends sitting around a table, eating. All my friends, that is, except for Frank. "Well, look who finally woke up," they all joked. We all laughed about our aching heads over toast and OJ. We waited there for Frank for over an hour. When he didn't come to join us, we went to his room to wake him up. It was time for us to hit the road and head back home. We knocked and knocked on his door, but he wouldn't answer. It got to the point where the hotel staff came to open the door. It was past our checkout time, and they were getting pretty impatient. The door opened, but Frank wasn't there. His bed had obviously not been slept in, and there was no evidence that he even made it back to the hotel that night. Had he not walked back with the rest of us? None of us could seem to remember how we got back to the hotel in the first place, let alone remember if Frank was with us. We tried calling him 100 times on his cell, but he just wouldn't pick up. After another hour, we called his girlfriend and family to see if he'd hitched a ride home or called a taxi or something. He wasn't with them. Hell, he wasn't with anyone. Frank was reported missing later that day. As of right now, 8.5 years later, he remains a missing person. We have no idea what happened to him that night, or even if he's still alive. We all, of course, sat around and tried to piece that fateful night together. Sammy says he remembers Frank bumping into some guy with stubble at the bar and spilling his beer all over him. Aidan confirmed this and said that the guy was getting really angry. Aidan also remembers seeing some guy with stubble later in a nightclub, staring at us constantly, but he's not sure if it was the same guy from the bar or someone else entirely. I remember us all being together outside the nightclub. Frank was definitely still with us at that point. Drew says that he remembers Frank shouting into his cell phone at some point, and said that he thought Frank seemed agitated and distressed. When he tried to ask if he was okay, Frank apparently became aggressive and told him to get lost. If that's true, then that was completely out of character. I'd never heard Frank raise his voice, never seen him get angry at anyone, even when he was drunk. He was a super mild-mannered guy. Miguel also seemed to remember Frank acting a little off, arguing with the bouncer at the club. He wasn't sure what he was arguing about, though. We all seem to have a few different pieces of the puzzle to share. Problem is, none of us can remember at which point we lost Frank. We gave a description of the stubble guy to the police, but they've never found anyone who matches our description. We wonder if somebody put something in our drinks that night. It's just crazy how little we remember. Anyway, Frank, if you're out there and you listen to this, please get in touch, buddy. We love you and miss you. Peace, brother. Hey guys, Lazy here, and thank you very much for listening. A big thank you to Anthony Salinas for making the thumbnail for this video. For those of you unfamiliar with Airbnb, it's a website that allows users to either list or rent residential properties. For people with a spare room or apartment, it's a nice way to earn some extra cash. And for everyone else, it's a convenient and cheap alternative to staying in a hotel. But with the site becoming so successful, and with millions of people making use of its service, there have inevitably been some hosts and guests from hell. Here are 3 disturbing Airbnb experiences. This happened to me on a trip to Lyon, France. I was travelling solo from the States and had booked a stay with this old couple in their house. I say old, they must have been in their mid-60s. It was a new listing and only had a couple of reviews, but they were both really positive. From the photos, I could tell that this place wasn't exactly a 5-star joint, but for the price, it was a steal, and in a great location to boot. That first night when I arrived, the older couple actually made dinner for me. It was a nice touch, and who was I to refuse? Their English was decent, so we chatted and shared a few stories, and afterwards I went to explore the city and get a few drinks. I must have returned around 10 PM, and my hosts were nowhere to be seen. In bed asleep, I figured. The pair had told me at dinner to help myself to a little wine, which is precisely what I did when I got in. Nice folks. Afterwards, I went up to my bedroom to settle down myself. Now, I usually have trouble sleeping, but that night I fell asleep with surprising ease. All the travelling that day had worn me out, and that little bit of wine probably helped too, I guess. I'm not sure what time it was, but I awoke in the night to a flash of lightning. You know when your eyes are closed, but you can still tell there was a flash of bright light? Well, it was just like that. I remained curled up in bed with my eyes still shut, waiting for the crash of thunder to come with it. I counted the passing seconds in my head. My mum always used to tell me that however many seconds there were between the lightning and thunder, that was how many miles away it had struck. So I'm there, counting away in my head. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 20, 30. That's odd, I thought. No thunder. It was then, through closed eyelids, that I sensed another lightning flash. Again, I waited for the thunder, but it never came. I sat up in bed and opened my eyes, just to see if my sleep-hazed mind was playing tricks on me. It hadn't been. Inside my bedroom were my 2 hosts. Initially, I didn't realize just how bizarre this situation was. I was still in that confused, just out of sleep state. Even still, I knew there was something off about their expressions. As my eyes adjusted, I could tell what was wrong. They were both wearing masks. Latex masks of old human faces with exaggerated features. The flashes had been from the camera the woman was holding. They had been taking pictures of me whilst I slept. The husband was nearer to the bed than the wife though, and he was in mid-step, moving closer. She was further back by the door. It was as if he wanted to be in the pictures. With me now awake, they both froze like a pair of mannequins. What do you want? At the time, I couldn't think of anything else to say. The adrenaline hadn't kicked in yet. I was more confused than freaked out. "You're dreaming," said the male, his voice muffled behind the latex mask. Then, backing up towards the door. "Good night." It wasn't until I noticed the metal wrench in the old man's hand that the situation fully dawned on me. I quickly gathered my shit and made for the front door, glancing around like crazy in case the old fucks tried to ambush me with the wrench from around a corner. Needless to say, I contacted the police immediately, though nothing ever came of it. My evidence was all anecdotal. The old geezers had been smart enough to delete all of the pictures. My complaints to Airbnb were largely ignored too, though the old couple did remove their listing from the site. I don't know what all of that was about. Some cult-like shit? A messed up fetish? Some fucking potential snuff pictures they were making? The old man was definitely in the shots, and it was clear that he was trying to step towards me quietly, wrench in hand. Whatever the case, I'll never complain about being a light sleeper again. I still check Airbnb regularly, just to make sure they don't use it to lure anyone else in. I'm a male living in South Korea. My cousin, Nari, used to be an Airbnb hostess here in Seoul. The site's become massive. There's something like 2 million properties listed on it, so no matter where you're traveling to in the world, chances are that there's somebody with a room or a condo or even an entire house to rent. During her time hosting, Nari met a whole bunch of colourful characters. There were the sweet older couple that came to stay with her 8 times while visiting friends in the city. There was the guy who insisted on bringing his dog with him. This little rat-sized chihuahua that was about half the size of my cat's. There were a few people who were high maintenance, and there were a few who were really chilled, and ended up joining us for drinks at the bar down the street. I never hosted personally, but I'd help Nari out with her bookings if she had to work late and needed someone to meet her guests. Well, for all the good people, there was Mr. Park. He was this creepy, balding guy that stayed with Nari for a week while he was in town on business. At least, he said that was his reason anyway. I think we were both relieved when he left. I'd met him once, and didn't like the vibe I got off the guy, and there wasn't much she could do to kick him out early or anything, lest he gave her a bad review and dropped her score on the site. After he left, Nari discovered a weird plastic thing he had left in the shower. Turns out, he had left his This is my cousin's story, and it takes place in Mexico. One of her old schoolmates, Claudia, had gotten married at a very young age to this rich guy. They had 3 children together, and, to the outside world, they were the ideal family. They lived on the nicest street in town, were fashionable and attractive, and seemed to have everything going for them. One thing my cousin always noticed was just how security conscious they were. They had cameras set up outside and even inside their house, and a state-of-the-art security system with all the trimmings. I don't know what the husband did for work, but my cousin always suspected it was something dodgy. Her friend never liked to talk about her husband's work, nor how they could afford such a luxurious lifestyle. Anyway, Claudia called my cousin one day and asked if she could babysit their kids that weekend. They had a party to go to, and their children were far too young to be left alone. They were only 5, 6, and 8 respectively. My cousin told her no problem. She needed the money and didn't have any plans that weekend anyway. She was a bit of a nerd back then. So, my cousin's at Claudia's home, all alone except for those 3 kids she was looking after. It was around 10 p.m, and she was in the kitchen trying to open a can of something when she nonchalantly turned around and saw a guy staring in at her through the window. The guy tapped on the window and said, "Sorry, miss, I didn't mean to scare you. Is this the Hernandez residence?" Hernandez was indeed the name of the family that lived there, but my cousin wasn't stupid. She said no and asked what he wanted, to which he replied, "Oh, nothing. My mistake. Have a nice night." My cousin was getting some bad vibes from this dude. He was polite enough, but had a harsh look about him. Not to mention the whole scenario was kind of off. Who goes around knocking on people's windows at 10 p.m? My cousin went to check on the kids upstairs. They were sound asleep in bed. She called up Claudia and her husband to tell them about this guy at the window, to ask them if they were expecting a delivery or something. Claudia's husband snatched the phone out of her hands and started talking to my cousin directly. He told her to make sure all the doors and windows were locked, to wake up the kids and hide them in safe places. My cousin followed his instructions. Within minutes, a slew of police cars arrived outside the house. Shortly after that, the policia had the guy at the window in handcuffs, along with 2 other men she hadn't even noticed before. They'd been waiting outside the house in a black Jeep. My cousin was extremely confused about what was going on. Everything was cleared up when the family reviewed the CCTV footage. The outside cameras showed the window watcher and his accomplices sneaking around outside the house. They were holding machetes. They split up to check around the residence, looking in through the windows. My cousin just so happened to look around when that guy got to the kitchen window. She couldn't see the machete he was holding. You see, Claudia's husband had gotten in with the cartels, and after some legal troubles, he'd testified against his former associates. As a result, they'd sent some goons to come and capture his children. Not to stop him from speaking against them, just to teach him a lesson. When they saw my cousin, they got confused and figured they might have the wrong address. They decided to wait outside for confirmation from their boss. Thankfully, the cops arrived just before that confirmation could come through. I don't know if these guys planned to kill the kids, hold them ransom, or sell them to the highest bidder. I don't know what they would have done to my cousin either if they had made a move. Thankfully, we'll never find out. If Claudia was home with the kids that night, things could have ended very badly. The family went into hiding after that, cut off contact with everybody, and started a new life somewhere far away. My cousin's not sure how they're doing these days, or what the husband does for work, since they obviously lost touch. But we all hope that their past never came back to haunt them. I was about 13 or 14, and I was babysitting 2 boys for some church members. I'd done it before, and the kids loved me, and the parents were very comfortable with me. This was a night where they were going to be gone until something like 2:30 in the morning. I was doing it for free that day, because they were going to do something church-related, and that's just how I rolled. Anyway, the house they lived in was an apartment complex. You know, one of those small ones that had 2 floors and 4 places in each spot. They're on the bottom floor, with 2 bedrooms on either side of the apartment, a kitchen on the left and a living room on the right, with a sliding glass door to the patio and a public bathroom next to the front door. It was about 1:30 in the morning, I think, and I knew they'd be getting home soon. The kids were knocked out, and I'd finished my homework. They didn't have cable, and this was before Netflix became an online service, but they did have a couple of DVDs and VHSs to watch, so I grabbed The Land Before Time to make the night go quicker. I was already very tired, and had nodded off a couple of times. Around 2 a.m, I could hear knocking on the front door. Knowing the parents had a key, I did nothing but sit there in the dark with the TV glowing. Being a paranoid person, and one who watches and reads a lot of horror, I grabbed the baseball bat that was next to the couch. What happened next will haunt me forever. I heard a small voice, almost like a young woman's. Oh dear, that won't help you. My heart stopped, and I realized the patio door didn't have the blind shut. My eyes shift slowly to the door, and I see someone on the patio, staring in. I couldn't make anything out, other than they were very short and wide. I screamed and ran into the kids' room. Thankfully, they were still asleep. Unfortunately, this was before I had a cell phone, and there were no cordless phones in the house. All I did was push the dresser in front of the door, and stared at the one window in the room. That's when it became dark, as a shadow loomed on the window. The knocking started again, and the woman's voice called out, "Come on, dearie. I won't hurt you. Please come out." The window was being knocked so hard I was afraid it would break. The kids finally woke up, and they were screaming and scared. I was a big girl, and could at the time lift my own weight, but knowing I had 2 kids with me, I became vulnerable and afraid. Within 2 seconds, I hear the father yell out, "Hey, who the hell are you?" The person ran off. The front door opened, and there was harsh knocking on the kids' bedroom door. Thankfully, it was the parents, and after I let them in, I put the dresser back and explained what had happened. They called the police. When they arrived, they found nothing, but the bushes that hid the patio had obviously been cut and torn to make a path. I babysat for them one more time after that, but they moved away 5 months later, and I never babysat anyone ever again. To this day, every time I hear a knock, a chill runs through me. This is a bizarre story, but I swear it's true, and my girlfriend can back me up on what I saw that night. My girlfriend had a babysitting job out at this country house in the middle of Nowheresville. The place was surrounded by woodland, and a good 10-minute drive from the nearest town. No neighbors or nothing. The prospect of staying there overnight all alone kind of creeped her out, so I, of course, agreed to head over there after work and spend the night with her and the kid she was sitting. I get there, and the silence of the area was kind of creepy, to be honest. There were no crickets or rustling or even any wind. The place was just without sound, if that makes sense. That sort of thing is a little eerie in the daylight, let alone at nighttime. So the night rolls on, and my girlfriend puts the kid to bed. We decide to chill out for a couple of hours and watch a movie that's playing on TV. I can't remember what exactly. We're both relaxing and cuddling up on the couch. All of a sudden, we both hear the front door open. Whoever opened it wasn't even trying to be quiet or conceal their footsteps in any way. In this really silent setting, their boots sounded like dumbbells hitting the floorboards. They got even louder as whoever it was made their way down the hall and towards the living room we were sitting in. Here's the strangest part. Both my girlfriend and I feel perfectly calm, not freaked out in the slightest. We have no idea why, but it doesn't even occur to us to be scared or concerned. We felt weirdly peaceful, unnaturally peaceful. The person walks into the room. It's a large man, around 40 years old and well built. He strolls in without hesitating, and then just stops and turns his gaze towards us. This smell of stale cigarette smoke hit the both of us immediately. Still, we didn't react at all. We remained perfectly calm. He stared down at us with wide eyes, not blinking. We looked up at him as if him being there was the most natural thing in the world. My heart wasn't racing or anything. He had this sort of cowboy presence, if that makes sense. That's the best way I can describe it. Relaxed, but austere and serious. Cool, but dangerous. He wasn't wearing stirrups or a cowboy hat or anything. Just jeans and a shirt, a little facial stubble, dark rings under his eyes. "Can we help you, sir?" I asked him, genuinely. He drew a big breath. "Don't go out in those woods tonight. I'm taking someone. It shouldn't be you. Understand?" "Okay, we'll wait until morning then," I said. He nodded, turned, and walked back through the hallway towards the front door. We heard it close behind him, and he was gone. We went back to watching our movie as if nothing had happened, then went to bed without a care in the world. It wasn't until the next morning, when we both woke up, that we realized just how disturbing that entire encounter had been. We couldn't seem to work out why we didn't feel a thing when he walked in. We asked the kid if he had a family member or someone he knew that fit that appearance. He didn't. We asked his parents later, who also didn't know anyone like that. They got pissed at us and asked why we didn't call the police or call them. We didn't have an answer. 12 months later, news broke out that a skeleton was unearthed in those very woods. The police started digging around the area, and a week later, another skeleton was discovered. In the following months, bones belonging to 5 separate victims were dug up from the earth. God knows how long they'd all been down there. Ever since then, there's been a police presence in those woods. I don't know who that gentleman was that came into the house that night, but my girlfriend and I both saw and heard the exact same thing, remember it in the exact same way. Why did both of us feel so peaceful that night, so unconcerned? It was a strange and chilling experience that we'll never forget, but I'm grateful it wasn't us that he took that night. Two years ago, right around Halloween time, I was babysitting for these 2 ladies who each had a son. They wanted to go out, so I stayed at one of their houses and watched the boys. It was around 8 p.m, and the boys were sitting on the couch, playing on their iPads and whatnot, when somebody knocked on the door. I asked if anyone was supposed to be coming over, and they both said no. I go over and check the eye hole in the door, and it's some guy in a grey hoodie, deliberately hunched over so I can't see his face. I don't say anything and start pacing around because I don't want to give him any inclination we're inside. A couple of minutes later, I check outside the little window through the curtains. He's gone. I didn't want to spook the kids anymore, and there weren't any more knocks, so I just kind of let it go as a prank. Cut to a few hours later, and the mums get back. They ask me how everything was, and I say that the kids were great, but somebody came to the door. They ask me at what time, and I say around 8. One of the mums starts freaking out and going through her phone. The other one tells me that right around that time, somebody had been making strange phone calls to them on a blocked number. They had disguised their voice and were saying things like, "I can see you through your window." They didn't think it was serious because it didn't make sense in the context of where they were, but in retrospect, we're almost positive it was me he was looking at through the window. They escorted me to my car, and I touched base later. Apparently, nothing strange ever happened after that, but I'm just really glad I didn't open that door, because I have a feeling in my gut it would have been really bad. I have memories from when I was a very young child of my babysitter putting me in the bath, filling it up with water, and then holding my head under it. She turned it into a sort of game, timing how long I could hold my breath underwater as she held my head down. I never felt like I was in danger. I really believed it was just some sort of fun game. Then we'd laugh about it, and she'd dry me off and take me down to watch TV on the couch. When I was a teenager, my mother told me something I wasn't expecting. That same babysitter I used to have had been arrested by the police years earlier. That's why she stopped coming around. She never told me this when I was young because she didn't want to frighten me, but apparently she had drowned a child she was babysitting in the bathtub. Then she went on the run. When I heard that news, all my memories of the bath game came flooding back to me. I had never told my mother about the bath game, and she had no reason to lie to me about something like that. That babysitter had just been using me for practice. Hey guys, Lazy here, and thank you very much for listening. Well, it's been a very, very long I met a guy who had been travelling Australia with a couple of friends, hitchhiking around as many of us had done. One of his friends told him they were near his distant uncle's house, whom he had never actually met before. He got a phone number from a family member, and as they had hoped, the uncle offered them a place to stay. He picked them up in a town and drove them out to his rural property way out in the bush. They said he seemed like a pretty normal guy, friendly and cheery. When it was time to set up a place to sleep, the uncle took them to a closet that was totally full of sleeping bags and bedrolls. Like, totally full. They didn't think much of it at the time, and all grabbed a kit and set up on the living room floor. They stayed there a couple of days, and nothing out of the ordinary happened. Afterwards, the uncle drove them to a bus station, and they were on their way. About a year later, that man, the uncle, was arrested and charged with several counts of murder. He was the man who was picking up young hitchhiking backpackers and slaughtering them. The guy who told me this story was 100% certain he had slept in the sleeping bag of one of the victims. I'm from Chechnya, and have witnessed more than a few bombings and shootouts in my life as a result of the insurgency here. Probably the scariest happened when I was about 9 or 10 years old. My father and I live in a village in the mountains. It was a hot point of the insurgency against Russia up until a few years ago. Russian FSB raids on insurgents there was somewhat common. Anyway, I was walking home from school with some of my friends one day, when all of a sudden we heard really loud bangs and booms in a nearby street. We all scatter like dogs. Me and my friend, Kazmat, hide in this back alley for a few minutes, just trying to lay low. The gunfire sounded like it was coming from everywhere, so we didn't want to move. Well, after about 3 or so minutes, this guy comes running around the corner and he's holding a rifle. He looks pretty young, maybe around 18, 19, 20. Long, dark brown hair, a scruffy beard that looked kind of funny because it hadn't grown in fully. I remember he was wearing a grey Puma hoodie. He was limping pretty bad as he'd been shot in the leg or been hit by shrapnel or something, and a lot of blood was coming out. We were behind a concrete wall, and he fired off a couple of rounds at whoever was behind the wall before running out of ammo. While trying to reload, he saw us and yelled at us something along the lines of, "God damn you kids, why are you here? Run!" Well, of course, being like 10, we were scared shitless and couldn't move. In the meantime, his gun jammed or something, because he was getting really angry and started crying and hitting his gun out of frustration. Right after that, on the other end of the wall, a guy with a ski mask and a bunch of armor pokes his head around the wall. He's a Russian FSB. He makes the shh hand movement, motions for us to lay low, and then shoots the other guy clean in the throat. He collapses and makes that awful, throaty sound people who get shot there make before they die. Me and Kazmat are hysterical at this point, because we're both kids, and the gunshots are ridiculously loud. We're scared we're going to die. A few more FSB troops come from behind the other side, shoot the guy's body a few more times for good measure, and then start stripping him, all the while making jokes about him, and talking about how they're going to take souvenirs from his corpse, and how much they love killing Chernozovy, a slur used by Russians for Chechens. They completely ignored us, until one, who I think was the one that shot him first, walks over to us and tells us to stop crying and to go home. He actually seemed somewhat empathetic and patted us on the back as we got up, saying something along the lines of, "Sorry you had to see that, but you did good." We slowly get up and leave. I'm not exactly haunted by it, as I don't have PTSD, but it's easily the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. I think about it sometimes. My father used to have 2 Cambodian employees that were cousins. They were survivors of the Cambodian genocide. They were in a labor camp that had no fences. If you ran, you would likely die in the harsh conditions. Every day, they would line up the prisoners and shoot one person at random, saying something like, "More of you will die if anyone leaves." They were kept there purely through fear. The 2 cousins decided to escape one day. One of their brothers was too afraid to go with them, and they left him behind. They said that they live with knowing that probably 100 or more people were killed because they escaped, but they tell themselves that those people would have likely died anyway. I was hitchhiking through South Australia heading west. I was about 14 years old at the time, and I got picked up by a carload of 20-something-year-old blokes in an old HQ. They were super drunk. At one point, one of these guys tells me that we're going to a party and asks if I want to come. Well, I was on a walkabout, and that's all about finding yourself and new experiences and all that. So I was like, hell yeah. But then, the driver got all upset. "No," he says. In a loud voice, he shouts, "Fuck you guys, not again." And he screeched the car to a stop in the middle of fucking nowhere. "Get out," he says to me. I'm like, what? And all these other guys are protesting. He looks me dead in the eyes and says, "Get out, now." He seemed pretty serious, so I did. Everyone else in the car was losing their collective shit, and I was left standing on the side of the road, 200 clicks from fucking anything. Now, I don't know what they were planning, but in retrospect, I'm fairly sure it wasn't anything good. I was at a bonfire where people were telling ghost stories, and a friend told us this story about his aunt in Mexico. Back when she was a little kid, 6 or 7, she lived on a ranch near some mountains, and one day she was playing outside and ended up going missing. A lot of people from the area came to help look for her, call for her, but nothing. Like a week went by, and the family had begun to give up hope. Then, suddenly, she comes out from the trees, dirty, and with her mouth sewn shut. The family take her to the hospital immediately. The story that the little girl tells them is that she was wandering around in the trees, and some duende, a folkloric creature, came out and asked her to play with them. So she goes with them in the woods, and when she starts to get hungry, they tell her that she needs to stay, so she does. But then it starts to get dark, so eventually she finds her way back home. She apparently thought she was only gone a couple of hours, not a week. Apparently, afterwards, that girl, the aunt, was never the same again, and she grew up to be a very quiet and reserved woman. He says she still has scars from where her mouth was sewn shut. So, while everyone at the time was telling stories about how duende are 100% real, and some people had even seen them when visiting their families in Mexico, that's definitely scary on its own. But for this story in particular, what's scary is that this 7-year-old girl was taken from her family ranch and held hostage in the woods for a week, where she was so tortured that she ended up blocking out what happened to her and came up with a story in order to cope. And then the people who took her sewed her mouth shut, probably thinking she would die before she ever made it back to her family's home. There's a freak story that never leaves me. A guy went missing in 2004. He had left his home without his shoes or jacket in October, and just before he disappeared, he had called his friends and asked if they wanted to come and go to a sauna with him, like a normal Finnish person might do on a Friday night. His girlfriend came home from work to an empty home, with lights turned on and the front door open. Case went cold, and the guy was never found. 4 years later, kids were playing in the woods near the missing guy's home, and noticed a scarecrow high in a spruce tree. They told their parents, who came to investigate, and they immediately called the police. It wasn't a scarecrow. It was the body of the guy who went missing 4 years earlier. He was tied to the tree, and the body had been there for the whole time that the guy was missing. It was officially ruled as a suicide. Now, the weird thing is that according to some Finnish crime websites, the rope wasn't tied around his neck like it would have been if he tried to hang himself and got stuck in the tree. He was sat on a branch facing the trunk, and his body was tied from 3 or 4 places to the tree. That doesn't really scream suicide to me. The guy was a drug user and had been to prison for drugs too. Some people on those websites think that his sudden disappearance and strange death might be related to drug debts. Did someone force him to climb the tree and tie himself up like that? Maybe he died of hypothermia up there, since temperatures in Finland in October can drop below 0. Maybe the debt collectors just left his body. Another strange thing is that the newspapers didn't tell where his body was found or how he died. Just that some kids had found him near his home, and that there was no crime. This story is so weird, it's disturbed me ever since I heard about it. My mum was an ER nurse. A guy comes in who had flown off his motorcycle face first, and slid down the road on his face. He was wearing his helmet, but it didn't help. Basically, he was shredded with no chin, no mouth, and no nose. All that was left were his eyes looking around in shock. Body was all scraped up too. He died. I have never ridden a motorcycle in my adult life after hearing that story. A bit over a decade ago, I helped carry a few dead guys out of an armoured car and into an ambulance. Like a testament to its maker, the armoured car was relatively intact, and the hull and cabin weren't punctured. The vehicle had been thrown so far and so fast that the occupants were almost liquefied in their own skin. I remember my buddy saying, "It doesn't matter how strong a hull is if you throw it far enough." The occupants were much harder to carry than normal dead weight, as they were floppy and contorted. They bent like Gumby moved. Thinking about it sucks, and I occasionally have nightmares. I'll definitely never forget it. I went to the bathroom in the middle of the night after some nightmares, and left my door cracked open before I got back into bed. When I fell asleep, I dreamt that I was outside my room. In the dream, I saw my door cracked open. I pushed it open and then saw myself sleeping. When I woke up, my door was wide open. So, years and years back, on an autumn night, I experienced my first and only bad trip from magic mushrooms. I ended up locking myself in my bedroom in my flat, and at one point heard the most horrible noises. Scratching and a kind of eerily wet choke over and over. It just never seemed to end. I was curled up in a ball, scared out of my mind at whatever this thing was trying to break through my wall. Well, it eventually stopped, but the night wasn't over for me, and stayed bad until I eventually drifted back to reality and passed out from the stress of what I had heard. Now, here's where the real horror comes in. Those noises weren't a part of my trip. My upstairs neighbor, whose staircase went along my bedroom wall, had died that night from an overdose. He had vomited into his lungs bad enough to be lethal, but not bad enough to be fast, and he'd been crawling up my wall, presumably to get my attention. I found out over the next few days that he wasn't alone. His best friend had KO'd on the couch, and the dead guy had gone into the bathroom to be sick. It went wrong, and when staggering out, he had fallen down the stairs, leaving him badly injured and stuck at the bottom, next to my wall. I don't see it as a case I could have helped in. Had I been sober enough to do anything, I wouldn't have been home at all. But as terrifying as what I felt was, I feel what he went through was a terror most couldn't imagine. I know I can't. Trapped, dying, and with people around, but you can't get their attention. That's nightmare fuel at its worst. Hey guys, Lazy here, and thank you very much for listening. Well, a little late with the Halloween video this year, but I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless. I think my Aunt Zara's story is a good fit here. She had just arrived in small-town Russia, wasn't fluent in the language, but knew enough to have a somewhat decent conversation. She had gone on account of some business venture, and had agreed to meet up with a contact there. I forget the guy's name exactly, so for the sake of this story, let's just call him Sergey. Stereotypical, I know. Anyway, she had been talking with Sergey on the phone. He was obviously a very charismatic and friendly chap. He said he'd arranged a hotel room for her. That way, when she arrived, she didn't have to worry about accommodation or anything like that. At the airport, there's a guy waiting for her with her name written on a board. This guy was Sergey's friend, the owner of the hotel that she was staying at. 5-star service, she thought. Now this guy was a bear of a man. Tall, bearded, and haggard looking, probably from a lifetime of drinking. He tells her that Sergey was coming to meet her at the hotel in a couple of hours. Fair enough. That's what she had agreed with him over the phone. She does her best to chat with the large man in Russian. It ended up just being her asking him a bunch of questions, and him responding with a chuckle or a smile. She wasn't sure if he just wasn't the talkative type, or if he literally couldn't understand what she was saying. Put it this way, she was much better at listening to Russian than speaking it. Anyway, she hops in the car with this guy, and they drive to the hotel. I say hotel. Apparently, the place was just a normal-looking house, more like a B&B than anything else. Perhaps something had just gotten lost in translation. They step through the front door, and the bear-like man shows her where she'll be staying. He opens the door to her room, revealing a set of wooden steps leading down into the basement. Okay, things were starting to feel pretty off. Are you sure this is the right room? My aunt asks. Light switch is there. She could only just about make out what he was saying. She stepped inside to flick the switch, and as she did, she realized that she had just made a huge mistake. As soon as her body was completely inside the basement, the door slammed shut behind her. She heard the heart-sinking sound of the lock being bolted. She obviously begins to freak out and screams for the man to unlock the door immediately. No answer. She continued to shout, demanding that he unlock the door. Her screams fell on deaf ears. In that moment, she realized just how powerless she was. There was one small window in the basement, with thick metal bars across it. The only things down there were a dirty mattress in the corner and a small pile of steel-linked chains on the floor. It was like a dungeon. All the stories and urban legends that she had heard about started flying through her head. The ones where people were held against their will for decades in some guy's basement, and the ones where people were forced to do unspeakable things. This was before cell phones, so she was completely alone, totally at the mercy of the man who had trapped her. She spent what must have been 15 terrifying minutes down there. She told me that, under those circumstances, 15 minutes feels like 15 hours. Then, from the hallway above, she heard the man talking with someone else. She could barely translate what they were saying, but whoever had walked in was not happy with the man who had locked her down there. The pair of them were shouting and arguing. That's when my aunt heard a familiar voice say something that filled her with both relief and horror. I told you, not this one. That's next week's girl. The door finally opened. Standing there was the man with the familiar voice. Sergey. Zara, there you are. There's been a mix-up. Come, I'll take you to a nice hotel. With that, she scrambled out of the basement, and, as you can imagine, straight onto the next plane home. Sergey obviously didn't want anything bad to happen to my aunt, but at the same time, he obviously knew about what was going on at the fake hotel. It even sounded like he was a part of it. To this day, my aunt doesn't know what that was all about. Were they luring girls to this fake hotel for human trafficking? Was it some sort of fetish dungeon? Perhaps it really was all just a major misunderstanding. For the sake of next week's girl, I really hope that was the case. Either way, there was no one to report the incident to. No one who would listen or care, at least. My aunt never went on any more international business trips after that. Not my story, but I'm involved in a way. Several years ago, my college roommate, let's call her E, worked as the night manager for a newly built hotel. As was par for the course, I would often bring coffee in at around 1 or 2 a.m. and stay and chat for a while. One night, I showed up to find E sitting at the front desk, shaking her head, looking completely perplexed. Allegedly, she had just checked in what could only be described as the doppelganger of our other roommate. We'll call her M. This guest looked just like her, down to the same height, hairstyle, eye colour, even the same southern accent, which is quite odd as we live in the north. E tried to speak with the new guest and show her a picture of M on her phone, but was rebuffed several times. We both chalked it up to a coincidence, as we knew that M was visiting her parents. We went on to enjoy our coffee. Shortly after 2, I decided to head home. It wasn't until around 2:30 a.m. when I pulled into our garage that I checked my phone. There was a series of texts from E sent to me and M. She had sent these messages at exactly 2:17 a.m. Stop. Not funny. You guys suck. What the hell? Naturally, I was confused, so I called her back. This is when things got weird. E sounded hysterical on the phone. Apparently, Em and I, in the same clothes I wore earlier, had been standing at the end of the main hallway, staring at her. E thought this was a joke and kept calling out to no response. Eventually, the front desk phone rang, and in the time it took to answer it, we both had disappeared. I calmed her down over the phone, and the next morning, we talked through the possibilities, trying to rationalize what she saw. The guest who did look like Em came back down to the front desk later that morning, inquiring about some service. Much to E's surprise, this so-called doppelganger only looked vaguely similar to our roommate now. The only thing that scares me to this day, and that I never told her, was that when I got into our house, the kitchen clock was stuck at 2:17. Directly next to it sat a photo of Em and I, smiling, that I had only developed that afternoon. I still have no explanation, and nothing weird ever happened at the hotel again, but it still makes me uneasy to this day. Staying at a hotel, I got into the lift from the top floor to head down. The lift stopped at the 4th floor. The door opened. I saw people outside, standing still, making no attempt to come in, despite me being alone inside. There was room for everybody. The automatic lift door then closed, and before it had completely shut, I heard someone outside saying, "Why is the lift so full of people?" Excuse me for not being an amazing storyteller, but this is definitely a true story. My mother used to work at a hotel in Washington, D.C. It was back in the 90s, and she was a housekeeper, or maid. She needed money because she was a refugee from Vietnam. Even though she didn't know much English at the time, she knew enough to get by at her job. Plus, all the other hotel staff and guests loved her because of how sweet she was. Because of this, anytime high-profile guests, such as the Backstreet Boys, would come and stay at the hotel, the manager always sent my mum to clean their rooms. One day, a guest came. We'll refer to him as Mr. M. He checked into their most expensive suite. As usual, the manager told my mum to take care of this room. As she got there was a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door, so she told the manager that she'd go back later. What was weird was that no one was ever allowed into Mr. M's room. The man stayed there for over a month, and not one time did he let any staff come in to clean. However, he paid a lot, and he always gave a warm welcome every time he passed a staff member or housekeeper, so no one paid him any attention really. Then, one day, people didn't see him anymore. They assumed he had checked out, even though the receptionist had no account of that. Since it had been so long since the room had been cleaned, the manager told my mum to go and check it out and try and clean up what she could. As she got to the room and unlocked the door, a disturbing smell hit her. She couldn't figure out what it was, but she continued to survey the room. It was disgustingly messy. In her words, it looked like someone had thrown a rave, despite the fact that no one else had ever gone into Mr. M's room. None of the other guests, at least. It looked like Mr. M had deserted the place without telling anyone. My mum was still shocked by the smell, so she tried to track it down. As she followed the smell, she could tell it was coming from the closet. When she opened the closet, there was nothing but a cardboard box on the ground. The smell was clearly resonating from it. My mother's first instinct was to open the box to see what it was, and to clean and throw it out. What she found scarred her. It was the rotting, decomposing head of a young woman. My mother immediately screamed and got out of there. She fainted in the elevator. Once she woke up, the cops were everywhere, and the hotel was like a CSI scene. The manager told her that Mr. M wasn't the guy's real name, and he had used a fake credit card to check in. The head of the woman was identified to be that of a call girl. I don't know much more, or any of the nitty-gritty details, but I'm sure you can look it up on the internet for more information. Needless to say, my mum quit that day. Staying at a hotel one night, I was reading a book in bed when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. I looked up to see a man staring in at me from the window, his eyes bulging. I shrieked and locked myself in the bathroom. After mustering up enough courage to come back out, the man at the window was gone. Nobody else had reported a peeping Tom staring in at them through their windows, and that was basically the end of the matter. None of this would have been particularly scary had my room not been on the 18th floor. There was no balcony, and no way for him to get where he was, much less get away. Whoever, or whatever he was, I can still picture his face pressed up against the glass in my mind's eye. I worked at a Canard Inn's doing banquet serving. I showed up to a shift, and the hotel was completely full of police. I tried to ask what was going on, and they couldn't tell me. My next shift, I asked one of the cleaning staff what had happened. Apparently, a woman and a man had checked into the hotel at around 11 p.m. At around 2 a.m., 2 more men came into the hotel and went to their room. All 4 of them left together a couple of hours later. When the cleaning staff came to clean the room at around 11 a.m., they found that the room was completely blood-soaked, splattered all over the walls and the floor. The mattress was soaked all the way through with blood. The cleaning lady joked about some sort of blood orgy. Since all of the guests left together, there was no murder investigation. To this day, I still wonder about what happened in that room. How could they all be walking out all healthy and fine if that much blood was lost? I worked as a chef for a Hilton. I remember speaking to one of the managers of a different downtown hotel, a very high-end place. He told me this story. The manager was on his way out of the hotel after working one evening, and he saw a homeless guy a ways out, sleeping on the lawn. He decided to walk back in, and told the front desk employees to try and get him off the property. He came back in for work the next morning, and saw the same homeless guy still sleeping on the lawn. He ran in to chew out the front desk manager. Why hadn't the employees done as he had asked? They both walked out to get the bum to leave, but found that the bum was wearing a nice suit coat. Turns out it was a wealthy businessman who had jumped off the 12th-story balcony and had just been there all night and half the day, dead on the lawn. No one saw him fall. Sad story, actually. Hey guys, Lazy here, and thank you very much for listening. So you're probably wondering where I've been the past month. I think this is the longest I've gone without uploading a video.